Hello, my name is Mark Simkin, and in this talk I'm going to present our work, Use Your Brain, Arithmetic Free PC for Any Modulus with Active Security. This is a joint work with Hendrik Eerikson, Marcel Keller, Claudio Orlandi, Pille Pullonen, and Joonas Puura. The focus of this work lies on secure three-party computation, where we have three parties. Each of those has a private input, and they would like to run some protocol such that at the end of the execution, they all learn the evaluation of a public function on their private inputs. We say such a protocol is passively secure if an adversary who corrupts one of those parties but follows the protocol description honestly cannot learn anything beyond what it can already deduce from seeing the output and the input of that party. We say a protocol is actively secure if an adversary who can deviate arbitrarily from the protocol cannot learn any additional information about the private inputs of the honest parties, and it cannot alter the output of the computation in some malicious way. A third security notion that we will need, which is somewhat less common, is passive security with weak privacy. So such a protocol is passively secure and has the additional guarantee that even if an adversary does deviate, privacy of the honest party's inputs holds up to the last round of the protocol execution. A common flavor of this standard secure computation setting is to consider protocols in the preprocessing model. Such protocols can be split into two parts: an offline phase where the parties perform some computation that is independent of their private inputs and independent of the function they would like to compute. Here they generate something called correlated randomness. And then once this correlated randomness is obtained, in the online phase, they can use the correlated randomness in combination with their private inputs to compute the function they would actually like to compute. The idea behind splitting protocols in this manner is to shift most of the heavy work into the offline phase, which is therefore usually a bit slower, but in exchange to obtain an online phase, which is extremely fast. When we say we would like to compute some function f, then we need to agree on a representation of that function. Throughout this talk, we will assume that the function is represented as a circuit. One common type are Boolean circuits, where the private inputs of the parties are bit strings and the gates in the circuit are logical operations. This is very convenient when one would like to compute something like AAS or a hash function evaluation, but it is less convenient if one wants to perform a computation that is more arithmetic in nature, such as computing some statistics or evaluating a neural network. What we commonly do in this case is we consider arithmetic circuits over fields, where the private inputs are field elements and the gate operations are additions and multiplications. Fields provide a very rich structure, which is very convenient for constructing actively secure protocols, but unfortunately fields is not exactly what we would like to do in the real world. In reality, we would like to compute arithmetic circuits over 32-bit integers or 64-bit integers, and these correspond to arithmetic circuits over rings. The problem with this model of computation is that it has a less rich structure, and it makes it harder to construct actively secure protocols. So what do we do in this work? In this work, we focus on the setting of three-party computation with one active corruption. And first, we present a compiler that takes any passive secure protocol with weak privacy and transforms it into an actively secure protocol. And actually, this compiler works for any n-party protocol. And then we show how to use our compiler in combination with other tools to construct practically efficient protocols for three-party computations over rings. And finally, we have full implementations of all of our protocols and benchmarks to evaluate their practicality. The starting point of our compiler is a previous compiler by Damgaard, Orlandi, and Simkin from 2018, where they showed how to transform a passively secure protocol into an actively secure one. So in this setting, we're given a passively secure protocol, and because it is only passively secure, a malicious adversary may send an incorrect message to Alice such that Alice produces the incorrect output. So this is what we need to prevent. And the idea behind our compiler was to imagine some virtual parties and let those virtual parties execute the protocol on their behalf in some way that prevents malicious behavior. And then at the end of this simulation by the virtual parties, the real parties should obtain the output of the function. So how was the simulation performed? Every virtual party was simulated by the real parties that are next to it. So every real party in this case simulates two virtual parties. And let's assume for a moment that the real parties corresponding to one virtual parties already magically somehow agreed on a random tape and an input for that virtual party. Now, the virtual parties execute the protocol on those inputs using those random tapes, and whenever one virtual party sends a message to a different virtual party, what actually happens is that the real parties simulating the sender each send one message to each of the real parties simulating the receiver. Now, because those parties use the same randomness and the same inputs, the messages should be identical if both parties behave honestly. So in this case, Alice, for example, will see, okay, she received consistent messages, so everything is fine. However, since we consider one corruption, an active adversary, if he sends an incorrect message, then the message will be inconsistent with the message of the honest party, so Alice will see that the messages are inconsistent and abort the protocol execution. Now, if we look at the efficiency of this approach, then we see that for every virtual message that is sent, the real parties have to send 3 real messages. One of those messages, one real party here has to send to himself, so this we can ignore. And why is this the case? Well, because the protocol is passively secure. Alice always needs to receive every message redundantly, immediately, to check whether the message that she received is correct, to see whether she can respond to this message. And now the idea is that if we have weak privacy, then Alice doesn't need to immediately check whether she received the correct message. Instead, she can optimistically execute the protocol by receiving the messages only from one of the simulating parties. And then in the last round, do a more efficient batch check using the second real party that simulates the sender to see whether all of the messages she received were indeed correct. So this is the idea behind our compiler. So if we assume we have a protocol with weak privacy, then we can transform it into an active secure protocol, basically using the same approach as the previous compiler, but slightly more efficiently. So the idea again is that in our compiler, the real parties first agree on the inputs and the random tapes for the virtual parties. This is done the same way as it was done in the previous work. In the second phase, the virtual parties execute the desired protocol using the simulation strategy that I just outlined. And then in the third phase, every party will perform one batch check to see whether it indeed received the correct messages. So what happens if one virtual party now sends a message to a different virtual party? Now, for every virtual party, we will select one real party who will act on behalf of that virtual party, and that party will send the messages to the receiving real parties. However, the second real party simulating the sender, for the moment, simply does nothing and doesn't send anything. Now, during the execution, Alice cannot check whether the message is correct. But then, in the last round before the protocol finishes, the second real party will send a digest of all the messages it would have sent to Alice, such that Alice can check whether the digest she received is consistent with the messages she received during the protocol execution from the other real party that simulated the virtual party. And again, if they're consistent, she will continue the protocol, and if they're inconsistent, she will abort the protocol execution. So now what is the efficiency of this approach compared to the previous approach? Now, because we don't need the 2 real senders to send every message redundantly immediately, now for every message we only have 2 real messages rather than 3, but in addition we have one small batch check at the end of the execution. Now that we have this somewhat improved compiler, what is the protocol that we actually would like to compile? Well, one protocol that fits exactly what we need is Beaver's arithmetic circuit evaluation approach from '92. It is a passively secure protocol with weak privacy. It allows for computations over rings, but it requires some correlated randomness, which we still have to somehow generate and take care of. To give a high-level idea of how this approach works, initially every party secret shares its input among all of the parties. And then the parties together evaluate the circuit gate by gate, where addition gates are computed locally based on the additive shares that the parties hold. And multiplication gates require some correlated randomness and some form of communication. And once the circuit is evaluated, the parties reveal the additive shares of the output wire of the circuit to reconstruct the output of the computation. To obtain our efficient three-party computation over rings, our overall protocol now is basically composed out of an actively secure randomness generation protocol, which is something that we customly built, and then the Beaver approach together with our compiler for the online phase. So how do we generate this correlated randomness? Now recall that the virtual parties are the ones that are executing the protocol, so they need the correlated randomness that Beaver's circuit evaluation approach needs. And the correlated randomness has the form of multiplication triples. These are additively secret shared multiplication triples of A times B equals C. So A equals A1 plus A2 plus A3, and B and C equivalently are also additively secret shared. Recall that the virtual parties don't actually exist. They are simulated by the real parties. And this means that the real parties simulating a virtual party need to have these corresponding inputs. And because every real party simulates two virtual parties, the additive secret sharing among the virtual parties corresponds to a replicated secret sharing among the real parties. So this means in order for the virtual parties to do a pre-processing to generate this correlated randomness, we can instead do an actively secure pre-processing of the real parties where they generate replicated additive secret shares of the multiplication triples. And on a very high level, what we do is, because we have additive secret sharing now, we first generate those multiplication triples optimistically, and then at the end we perform one batch check to see whether all of the generated triples have indeed been correct. Now that we have a protocol in the preprocessing model, a natural question is to ask, can we maybe get a variant of our protocols without actually needing to do the preprocessing? And yes, indeed, we can get one, and it works as follows. So what we do is, in the first phase, the parties secret share their inputs. So in this case, I'm speaking of the virtual parties, basically. And the second phase, the virtual parties evaluate the circuit in a gate-by-gate fashion, where the multiplications are performed optimistically. And now, because we don't know whether the multiplications have been performed correctly, we simply perform one batch check of those multiplications before we output the result of the computation. So the overall runtime of this protocol is smaller than the runtime of the protocol where we do the pre-processing and the online phase. However, if we focus just on the online phase, then this is slightly more expensive because now we need to do this batch check inside of the online phase rather than do it in the pre-processing. To evaluate the performance of our protocols, we have implemented our protocols and extensively benchmarked them. For this, we have taken 3 parties from 3 different continents. So here we have taken a party in San Francisco, Frankfurt, and Tokyo. And they have then performed computations over 64-bit integers. For all of our protocols, we provide full implementations in MP speeds and ShareMind. And in terms of performance, we show that we can achieve over 10 to the 5 multiplications per second. And if we consider parties from the same continent, so we tested parties that are in London, Frankfurt, and Paris, then we can even achieve around 10 to the 6 multiplications per second. So this has been a very high-level overview of our results, and I encourage you to see our paper for more details on our protocols, as well as a more detailed description of our implementation and the benchmark results. Thank you for your attention, and goodbye.